In this episode of the Living Code podcast, I speak with Ben Christensen, who is a member of Cultural Infusion's Atlas team. He's the VP of Innovation and Impact, as well as a member of AI 2030. Ben and I had a wild, far-ranging conversation about ethnography, the study of culture, anthropology, how we as humans can learn and adapt and change in a similar way, and drawing the parallels to the whole AI safety initiative and how do you train safer and more effective large language models. We also talked about the future of humanity in a world where cognitive labor is being rapidly devalued. So check it out. It's been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Hello and welcome to the Living Code podcast. My guest today is Ben Christensen, a builder at the intersection of technology, culture, and human flourishing. He serves as head of partnerships at AI 2030, a global initiative working to mainstream responsible AI by 2030, and as VP of Innovation and Impact at Cultural Infusion, whose Atlas platform is redefining how organizations understand the cultural and demographic diversity of their people. Before all of this, Ben co-founded the SAP Interfaith Alliance, which helped make SAP one of the first major enterprise tech companies to be recognized as a top faith-friendly workplace globally. He's also AI 2030's representative to the AI and Faith Coalition, a cross-tradition body bringing religious leaders, technologists, and civil society together around what AI means for human flourishing. Ben, welcome.
Thank you, Andrew.
Fantastic. It's a joy to have a chance to be here with you in conversation. I've really been enjoying my conversations with you over the last few months. We had a connection. So I found you first when I discovered this AI and Faith initiative. I was quite curious about what that meant and how that manifests. And we had a lot of really rich conversations. And the last thing that we were discussing in private, where we decided we should have a podcast session on this, was this question about what is the role of humans in a world where, with the Industrial Revolution especially, the physical labor value of humans labor's become a commodity and the marginal value of that has declined a lot. Now we're potentially at a place of rapidly diminishing value of the cognitive labor of humans. And so eggheads like you and me, who pride ourselves on our intellect, memory, ability to calculate and process and speak and so forth, all of that has become commodified. And so then the question is, what is the role of humans in a post-cognitive labor workforce, or where cognitive labor has been cheapened? Welcome to the Living Code podcast.
I feel so welcome. And I feel like this is one of the most important topics that could be covered by something that calls itself the Living Code, by the way. That doesn't get old, because code and living, I'm sure there's no shortage of technology and thought and contextual nuance there. But our conversation, if you don't mind me saying, that you just framed, epitomizes that so well, because we're in the roaring 2020s, second half of the roaring 2020s, if I may so say. And you invoked the history of industrial revolutions and roles of humans and how we relate to the machines and the tools and also each other in these new stages of economy that we're in. The one that we're in is fascinating. And when you brought up the word cognitive, the role of a human in a post-cognitive, I think that's the way that you said it, post-cognitive industrial revolution or AI. Correct me where I'm misreferring to this. I found that lit up the last 100 years of how I understand the history of humans working together. And it also sparked this interest in me. That's one of the best questions and most important questions we should be asking. And I believe that the first most important skill of our time is question intelligence. That is question design, asking the right question at the right time. Because one of the things that characterizes our time together here right now is we have all the information available to us, or we feel like we do. So the question is, what are the questions that we ask of that information? What knowledge do we invoke into existence by our careful queries?
And how well can we internalize the answers, right? Because I know one of the characteristics of generative AI is it generates a lot. And so even our ability to read, internalize, understand the meaning, and to listen, I think is also a key challenge.
Listening is right. As you're speaking, I'm getting all of the devices in my life making boots and beeps and dots.
I was wondering, so that's a background, that's part of the background music of my life.
I think we need to make it part of what's going on here until I figure out how to silence it, because there's a background radiation in my mind as well, and in my heart, in my spirit. And
Nice.
most of my day is trying to figure out how to reclaim my mental, physical, cognitive, spiritual stamina of any kind by separating what's noise and what isn't. That is, what is signal and what is noise. So,
with 3 kids and a demanding job and large-scale aspirations for shifting the trajectory of society, not that you're an overachiever or anything, but
I just love the way you said that. Yes. Shifting the trends of society, because I am one of the folks who believe that we can and we should and we ought to. If you ever thought that a small group of people couldn't change the world, well, that's the only thing that has. Whether that's insane or not, I subscribe to it. And I don't want to be insane, so I really hope that it's a sane thing.
yeah. And I happen to remember that was Margaret Mead who said that. And she's such an interesting character, Margaret Mead, because she was an anthropologist hanging out with all of these cybernetics people in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And these photos of the early cybernetics crews, she's often the only woman pictured. And so she had this boldness in being in a space where there at that time she was already a groundbreaking figure. And the cybernetics folks, I mean, I became a bit of a nerd on that topic, but that was the precursor for AI and robotics and cognitive science, machine learning, all these kinds of things. And it was fundamentally cross-disciplinary. And I know a lot of our conversations have also been cross-disciplinary. They've been characterized more by curiosity around understanding the problem and understanding what's really going on and trying to humble ourselves in the face of an overwhelmingly big world, right? So we can see there's an overwhelmingly big world. How do we respond?
Those are the right questions. I want to call that the Margaret Meadian law of approaching because she has that anthropological background I didn't realize. I think that's an appropriate way to look at it. And the first way to make sense to answer your question, if it was me answering, is to be more curious about the humans around us. Not that everyone needs to be an anthropologist, but to some extent, the principles or the disciplines of anthropology is how humans get to know each other, unless we're hermits or survive or whatever it is. But our relationship to each other, probably even as hermits, frankly.
Are you a
Everyone
person who studies humans, Ben? Are you a person who studies humans?
I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm an amateur anthropologist. Ethnography is how I prefer to identify. Although there's people who are actually ethnographers who would be like, oh, wait, where's your field study research and your PhD thesis and all this? And with dear respect to them. Yeah, so let's frame it that way. This is who I was trained by, what I studied, and I find this is very important. Why? Ethnography, cultural writing. That's the literal translation from the etymology that I understand. And understanding computer-supported collaborative work, the field of CSCW, was introduced to me as I was studying in Copenhagen as the study of the cultures of how people work with machines and their ecosystem of artifacts, or their ecology of artifacts, and how that interacts with them and helps them relate to each other as well. So yes, to that extent, I will call myself a person who studies people.
Reminds me of my brother, who's not got any degrees in archaeology, but is absolutely obsessed with archaeology. And he'll go out with a group of 12 like PhD archaeologists, and he'll find a dozen artifacts and they'll find nothing, because he senses into the environment and imagines where would, indigenous Native Americans live, where would they get water, where would they shelter, where would they hunt, and so forth. And that actual acquired sensitivity, I always feel like anthropology is a little bit wasted on the dead. Whereas, there's so much anthropology happening in every corporation in the world, every business transaction, every friend group, every subway, right? Anthropology is alive. There's 8 billion humans in the world, right? So we need all of us, I think, to learn something about that lens. So that intersects a little bit with cultural infusion, and not to turn this into an advertisement, but like, what is that? How does that work? What are you trying to do there?
Our flourishing, we need each other for flourishing, just to build on what you were saying before and to answer your, so I resonate with everything you were saying there. And Atlas is an analytics tool, a lens to be able to understand who the body of people that you work with, who they actually are, with the nuances of human identity that can approach the full spectrum of what we should call who are we as a people, as individuals, with the many different facets and dimensions that we are. Because if we don't know that, we underperform, we lose out on great opportunities that we could have for innovation, for collaboration, frankly, for joy and progress. So, Atlas enables folks with the most robust analytics on the cultural identifiers that humanity has ever come up with. And yet, there's no IEEE standard for human identity, nor should there be, perhaps, because IEEE is about classifying technologies. Humans aren't necessarily a technology. But I bring it up just as a moment to say, in this age where we're interacting with non-humans, and I say non-humans as folks who are as agents, let's just call them AI agents, of things that we have emotional relationships with because we can speak to them as if, and they respond back in ways that evoke our emotions. Those things shape us, and we shape each other by the way we interact with these tools. And I don't know if you've ever felt misunderstood. I have, and I'm guessing most people have. I've only ever been myself. But how much more then will an entity that is not a human probably misfire when it comes to summarizing who I am and who each other are? And so I think there's a lot that we can do in an optimistic way in coloring the full spectrum of nuance of where our cultures come from. Functionally speaking, you asked a very simple question. Tell us about Atlas. You can use that to make better leadership decisions when you're able to map who the people you work with are in a secure, anonymous way.
And so I feel like we've been talking about a bunch of abstract things, right?
It's
Studying
been so
humans,
abstract.
and so grounding it in. I'm in San Francisco area these days. I've got a co-working space with a nice view of the whole city, and we've just looked out the window sometimes these days, looked at all of these big tech companies, and there's this question, are mass layoffs coming? Like 40, 50% of all of these current tech workers, are they all at risk of being laid off? That is a lot of the chatter around the town. And in San Francisco, there's a lot of stuff that's visible, a lot of big buildings, a lot of people, a lot of tech companies, a lot of people living on the street, right? And so you can see this visible contrast, wealth inequality and disparity and so forth. And all of these people like you and I who've made our livings in the tech field and managed to get reasonably well compensated for that compared to other options. You and I didn't go off and become anthropologists or archaeologists. Tell us about that transition. What do you think's going on there or might go on? Or
The AI transformation bloodbath, if I may so call it, in that it releases so much talent into the market suddenly, becomes an opportunity for what I would call corporate refugeeism. There's climate refugees, there's war refugees, there's lots of types of refugees, but one of these things, one thread is economic mobility. And what I see happening is something that has happened historically in human history. Humans historically tend, when economic mobility is threatened, to trade away fundamental freedoms of expression for security, or hard won freedoms for newfound economic security or otherwise physical security. And that's one trend that I see that's happening here. And the other is folks have an opportunity to become entrepreneurs, whether they planned on it or not. And in many cases, that's a great thing. But the challenge and opportunity that I find useful, if we're speaking tangibly, is there's this immense supply of highly qualified individuals who can solve problems. And if we can connect each other and empower folks to take that step, because it still takes some bravery, even if you are a forced entrepreneur, because that's the only way that you can see what to do. Let's find ways to enable that. That also might be needed in the future based on the trends that we're looking at. What jobs, even if you're studying at the best school right now, do you expect to be able to get, is a question that is going around. And so let's find ways to enable each other to build and accomplish what we're trying to do individually.
I agree. I think it's a very important comparison, right? These different kinds of refugees, climate refugees versus economic refugees, even among the privileged class.
Privileged, if we may so say that.
White males in tech, right? We're arguably among the most privileged folks around, and yet survival anxiety hits everybody equally, right? We have this amazing ability to become accustomed to whatever standard of living we have. There's a tendency to always be spending next year's paycheck, right? Like budgeting as if we're going to be making what we think we'll be making next year and these kinds of things. And so there is a lot of the 20th century was characterized by this incredible escalation of privilege and opportunity and material abundance. And I certainly grew up with, we never missed a meal due to lack of funds. There were always abundant gifts on Christmas. You know, my parents, I think, really celebrating that success of the greatest generation, right? The baby boomer generation in offering material abundance to their kids that, you know, previous generations maybe didn't have. You know, the dynamics, I think nobody knows what's coming, but everybody senses the systems are breaking down, right? At all scales, like things are breaking down at a huge scale. I had just a micro idea that came to me as we were discussing. A lot of human history has been about moving from small, like subsistence farms where, you know, you're just looking after, you know, your family, up to doing things at greater and greater scale. A lot of the civilization was about scaling things up. If you start looking at a world where more and more people are pushed into micro entrepreneurial roles, it's almost like we're scaling back down again. You know, historically, humans, the sun and the earth have provided enough resources to build a little bit of a food farm for yourselves. Will the environment of the future provide enough, whatever economic and biological resources to sustain billions of entrepreneurs?
And I'm going to emphasize that. Will the environment of the future be sufficient or abundant enough to sustain this next fabric texture of human civilization's entrepreneurs? Because that conjures up some great questions. Every day, the sun is showering this planet with abundant energy, more than we have the capacity to capture and even convert into other types of energy. And in these last 100 years, we've found ways to do that, specifically with solar panels and other things. And even oil is arguably recycled sunlight, gone through several changes. But to your point, from a day's allotment of sunlight in a local plot of land, what does that look like for one of the 2 billion people on this planet right now? It's a very, very good question.
And it kind of takes us back to this original question we started out with, which is, I don't know, I'll speak for myself. I've never been hired for my brawn, right? I've never been paid just or I have not spent much time being paid just to lift heavy objects. And I have been hired for my cognitive ability. I could write, I could think, I could do software development and so forth. Can I do those things as quickly or as well as a large language model? I'll go ahead and say definitely not as quickly, not as well. Yeah, probably. Like there's still certain things I can contribute, but I feel sometimes an acute discomfort when I work with these large language models. I'm like, it's humbling. And I think that some of the big pushback we have on the future of AI is because it's cognitively humbling, right? To have something that's a machine that can outthink, right? So what is our role?
This pushes me to think of to answer that question, what can I do? What's different here? I'm agreeing with what you're saying. And as I'm interacting with the latest model, I'm thinking, okay, I can be a creative producer. It doesn't do anything until I ask it to do something for now, because that's the whole point, is things that are intelligent enough and have enough contextual awareness and the authorization from hopefully a human to act on behalf of my interest or creative direction while I'm awake or asleep. Those are the things that are going on as concepts. And I'm pushed into thinking about poetry and humanities, which don't always look like the first things that would ever solve the economic mobility pressures that I'm feeling. If you don't mind me saying, I'm like, well, the AI generated art isn't as good, and the why and the soul and the purpose of whatever it is. I go to that argument, which is well rehearsed in society today. And it brings me back to human connection, specifically something Carl Jung said. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemicals. If there's any reaction, both are changed.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
I take a moment to extrapolate that. As an individual, you and I interacted, I come
Yes.
away a different person, or because of
Yes.
your unique personality, a different facet of who I am gets illuminated, and I walk away with some insights, and I'm actually slightly or more different. And so those interactions, if I'm subscribing to Carl Jung's point, which I do, happen between humans and are increasingly important in terms of purpose. Now my job or my mind goes to think, well, what about interactions between the this tool that can do these cognitive load tasks better than I can, so much that it's humbling both of us. Turns out we shape each other too. It
Hmm.
learns from my queries and prompts, and I learn
Hmm.
from it. And
Hmm.
I come away thinking differently on what's possible because that's there. I'm like, oh, now it helps me think bigger, hopefully, and hopefully not in a way that destroys whole reservoirs because I'm prompting a water guzzling large language model. But thinking bigger in terms of, well, what can I do now if I can offload, whether I should or not, that part of my cognitive capabilities,
Right.
and it also learns from what I'm doing. So there's this co-shaping. I don't have the answer. That's just where my mind goes. Yeah.
What would make you, it seems pretty risky for you to come into this conversation with the recognition that you might be changed by our interaction, right? Because you're a lovely guy, competent. I've seen your LinkedIn profile. You seem very competent. You've got a family. You've got all kinds of good things going on and so forth. I'm some more or less random stranger. That seems quite risky for you to open yourself up to being changed, especially the idea of opening yourself up to being permanently altered through an interaction with somebody else. What would make you be willing to do that versus not do that? Be contaminated by me.
You're right. That is risky. And you framed it in a way that I hadn't really thought of before. Do
So
it.
I just want to introduce, right? Ben and I do not have any romantic association, but with romantic associations, there's sexually transmitted infections, right? STIs. So there could be culturally transmitted infections, right? So you're at risk of a CTI, contracting a CTI. Like if there's some idea that I have that
Yeah.
is somehow insidious or would alter the course of your existence, why would you take that risk?
And you're
If that's
clever
not
enough,
too.
and you're clever enough that it is a real threat, that you could be like the movie Inception, planting an idea that is going to grow, like that I won't be able to resist, perhaps by the nuance of your craft of communication. There's a real risk there. But to your point, it may not be non significant changes, not just changes, could result from our interaction culturally. And that is such an important conversation that I hope all the builders of large language models are working on, and anybody working with technology. And here's why it's important. I'm not the same person I was a year ago. I'm not going to be the same person a year from now that I am today. And if I was, I would be very disappointed.
Nice as former Ben was.
Right? Right? I don't know. Look at yourself, look at myself 10 years ago. I'll do it for me. As you said, I can only speak for me. There's things I've always felt generally self assured and mildly proud, if I may so say, of who I am. I know it's a very dangerous thing to say, and that's also an issue. But I've always been the protagonist, I would like to think, in my own narrative. But I'm also horrified when I look 10 and 15 years ago at, at who I was in some ways. And horrified sounds like, wow, that sounds kind of terrible, right? But to your like I'm so glad at the evolutions that have taken place, right? And I really hope that I can continue to do that. And how that relates to taking a risk to interact with somebody, I just thought of it this week. My flourishing depends on the resilience and flourishing of the people around me. For me to get ahead in progress in simply an income that I think is robust and allows me to provide for myself and family is great in and of itself. And I realize, but if my peers around me are not able to do that as well, that's a net risk. It's still selfish. It's a net risk to me as well. A shared resilience and flourishing is important. So my goal has, for me, I'm driven by that. But also, there's an enrichment that comes. First of all, risk is always great, depending on your appetite for risk. There's an enrichment that takes place with interactions. I'm going to cite the German author Hermann Hesse to illustrate this. In A Journey to the East, he wrote, "He who travels far will find things far removed from what he once held as truth." And that's not an exact quote, so you'll have to cite that. But he who travels far finds things far removed from what he once held as truth. I subscribe to this paradox and I'm upset by it. And I heard it first when 20 years ago I was traveling in Switzerland. I was reflecting on how my life was changing. And I just saw Switzerland is not that different in many ways. But the fact of geographical travel just changed the way I came back to my mindset in Utah, which is where I was born and raised. And I learned over time that a person who travels far emotionally and intellectually and mentally, not just geographically, will also find things that are, at least in my case, a paradox or an opposition to things that I thought were absolute truth. There's things that I think are absolute truth, I still hold them, but I found things in my travels, and especially when I'm exploring another person's culture. And I found that, wow, okay, whatever map I'm making of what truth is or what the deity that I worship is, it's clearly bigger than I thought because I can't cancel these things out so easily. So I'm gonna upgrade my thinking to a new level and be like, okay. And it helps me be more open. It's like the more you learn, the less you know, type of a thing. And I think I need that because Andrew, if I didn't interact with you, I would just think I know what I know. It's dangerous. I might even trust my own motives, which David Brenner taught me that we should not do.
That's very powerful, right? That I might even trust my own motives. Such a powerful thing, right? Because the discussions around AI existential risks and so forth largely center around what are the underlying incentive structures around the evolution of these large language models? Why are we, running towards AGI as fast as we possibly can? Hint, a lot of it has to do with the $1 trillion of capital that's been invested in there with the expectation of at least 10% return per year, ideally 20%, 100%, and so forth. And so there is 100% humanity's profit motive is in the foreground. There's a lot that we could touch on here, but I love, if I may keep the mic for a minute more. Well, first of all, Hermann Hesse, Journey to the East. It's not possible to journey to the East anymore in the way that Hermann Hesse did, because the East has come to the West and the West has come to the East. So the first time I ever went to the East was when I went to Singapore. And I went to Singapore with a group of 500 mostly white Buddhist monks and nuns. And as a teenager, I had this vision of like what Asia would look like, mist-shrouded hills, and what I would look like as a monk. I imagined myself with a staff and sandals, just walking through the hills, mist-shrouded hills, sitting in a cave and meditating. And that was for me the East. And if I can, reveal my, middle-class white American prejudices, I thought every time I met an Asian person, I assumed they knew martial arts. And every time I met a person of Indian origin, I assumed that they, had a guru. My first time coming to Singapore was basically, it's Los Angeles full of people of Chinese descent and Malay descent. It's the hotel where we had this Buddhist festival, where my teacher, a Tibetan Lama, and all of us devoted, mostly white students, would leave the teachings and the meditations and the retreats and so forth and go to the food court and just pass all of these designer goods stores. So it was Gucci, Armani, Ralph Lauren, all of these designer goods stores filling this conference center in Singapore. And so the East is no longer the East. The East is more the West than, I'm more Eastern than most Eastern people in a bunch of ways. And I'm thinking about, you're in the Mormon tradition. You did your mission trip, the 2-year mission trip. And I'm just reflecting on what a risky thing it is to send all of your finest young men, and I think now women, out around the world, knowing that, yes, they might be able to evangelize the faith, but they will not return the same person that they left.
Right. They'll come away different in ways that are unpredictable and probably wonderful. But if you don't mind, I'm an optimist, so.
Well, that's great. The level of resilience that's required to go to a foreign place with like one other friend and then just to go and meet a lot of strangers. I think it's why Mormon people make some of the best salespeople in the world and some of the best business people in the world, because it requires such a sustained hope and optimism and resilience and, ability to absorb insults, small and large. And it's such a hardening, if you know metallurgy, annealing, this process, annealing, where you take steel and plunge it into cold water, then you heat it up and plunge it into cold water and heat it up and plunge it. That's what forges the strongest steel.
I feel like you're an expert in this and you have the words to articulate it. It sounds like something that you understand very well.
I, for whatever reasons, have found myself called to throw myself into unfamiliar situations and having the optimism that I would survive and come out better and stronger. And I feel like that's the essence of a learning mindset. Not that I always embody it. I cling to safety as much as the next guy, but like I've thrown myself off a bunch of risky cliffs, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, that risk is fascinating to me. The algorithmic disgorgement is the term that I learned in the last couple of years, is what a company has to do when they are asked, they're found legally liable for something in their model, and they have to unlearn, unteach, or undo and start from scratch their whole large language model algorithms. And I thought, well, what is that for a human intelligence, an HI, if you will? That's like unlearning. And there's a there's a story of a person learning to ride a bike. They ride a bike. Now they reversed the handlebars.
Right.
This how that
Check it out
works.
on YouTube, everybody. If you haven't seen that, check it out on YouTube. Backwards
And,
bike.
and I'm like, wow, as plastic as a human brain is, it is very difficult to algorithmically disgorge or unlearn that. And yet there's some things, and this is where it comes back to trust for me and relationships. Someone said trust is the ultimate human currency, and this might have something to do with the original question of this podcast. What is the focus of a human in a post cognitive industrial era where AI can do this so well in place of humans, as perhaps, is I will trust a system that can ask itself every year recursively, is my moral or ethical guidelines still moral? Like as if they went on a journey with Hermann Hesse to the East and is able to ask that question. And then could they even act on it? Because this is one of the things that I'm trying to do is there's some things that I've changed in my moral and ethical framework. And I don't know how inflexible the AI systems that we may be outsourcing our cognitive intelligence to are able to, should they discover that, this may not actually do that, but it's so expensive, or I don't want the humans to find out, or it's just economically just annihilatory for this agent to algorithmically disgorge itself, even if it was commanded to, right? Can it ask itself? Then I would trust it more. I like humans because humans can change.
That is, as you said, that is a very optimistic framing. Humans can change. Humans do change whether they try to or not, like to or not. However, I would say that on average, the default is to be defensive. You described, you've generally always been the protagonist in your own story. And one of the things that came to my mind at that time is that more than that, I think that I know you to be a very pro-social being. I think you have worked hard to be the protagonist in other people's stories. And so you're trying to see the world from their point of view, and from the point of view of my wife and my children and my coworkers, do they see me as the protagonist? And I certainly have been very obsessively fixated on this question about how can I be the hero instead of the villain. If there's this drama triangle, victim, villain, hero, that all stories throughout the whole of human history are, this circulation between victim, villain, hero, and I've always wanted to be the hero and not the villain. But I guess two issues that emerge from that. We can't guarantee that people will always see us as the hero and not the villain. It would be denying you your freedom to insist that you always have to see me as the hero and not the villain, or you always have to see me as the victim and not the villain. That you should have the freedom to see me however you want to see me, which is one weird part of that, like seeing the world from others' eyes and giving them freedom. I know that for me, even my efforts to be good and to be a good person have often been very limiting and constrained by the fear of somebody seeing me as bad. That like the level of maturation and learning and growth that's required, I think even requires us to break out of those clear mental models. So I don't even know if I'm a good person anymore. I could try to be, but to open up the possibility that maybe I'm not is actually really important for me to learn moral lessons. Maybe there's things that are from somebody else's point of view. I'm not a good person. Tell me more. Why? How am I harming? What's going on?
You nailed it. This is something, write this down, everybody. This is a big deal. There's this fear-love spectrum of being motivated by fear or love that I've been studying recently. But so to your point, in a social group where I thought I was the protagonist, but it turned out that I was forcing a very desired outcome that I thought was desirable for everybody, I realized on retrospect that I was not the protagonist in this situation, and it was made clear to me. I was more like the Lucifer who is depriving of their agency. It comes back to agency, human agency. And I'm like, oh, and yet I thought I was, this comes back to, do you trust your own motives? And if I do, is that problematic? No, it's just self confidence. No, it might be problematic. If I'm not able to ask that question, I may be the protagonist in my narrative, but that doesn't mean I don't have the potential to become a villain and that I may not even notice it. And I think that's a really helpful thing. Another thing that helps me resolve conflicts is imagining folks who I feel like have done harm, whether intentionally or not, that they're probably the protagonists in their own narrative. I try to get there, and I'm like, what must be true for them to have acted in that way? And then I try to go from there, and I'm like, it helps me have some sort of empathy or try to dig up the capacity to forgive or see things in a different way.
And this kind of is all of this for me is flirting with and circling around this whole AI and faith initiative. And I believe, there's many levels to what faith can be, has been, well, is and has been and can be, right? If we think about the past, present, future of faith in human society, what's helped me a lot is to think that the world's religions, the religions of the axial age, so to speak, the ones that started in the few centuries BC, a lot of them emerged during the transition when humans were moving from villages to cities, and you're all of a sudden pressed together with all of these people who don't speak your language, don't look like you, have different cultural characteristics. And so I think of that as like similar to the way AI safety layers are co-evolving with these large language models to help monitor the outcomes and look at the outcomes and tweak and tune, that there are these sets of mythologies that have emerged in human civilizations to try to create a safety layer for that civilization, that to move that group from a state of greater anxiety to a state of greater peace, from a state of unhappiness to happiness, from a state of being weak to a state of being strong. And so how is it that humans have armored themselves with these, faiths and mythologies and so forth? There's a certain basic layer of like basic morality, and that's very important, but it's also normalizing, right? But then there's a transcendent layer of that as well. Ben?
In the words of a co-founder of the Interfaith Alliance at SAP, there's a social source code that could be called what those axial religions are, that
Right.
it provided a way for societies to map or train themselves and reinforce themselves in certain ways. It says, speaking of living code or source code. And I loved the person that person said that. Her name is Suzette Mesa. That helped me understand that perspective. That was really helpful, the way that you presented that. As with most things you say, it makes me think in new ways.
That is the original meaning of, or one of the original meanings of living code, is that we have had these cultural source codes. These source codes need to be living traditions, just like, we both have inherited our parents' DNA, but the epigenetics allow very different aspects of our genetic code to be expressed, and some level of mutation required to adapt to new environments and the evolutionary pressure. And I feel that these source codes, these of humanity, are under dramatically different evolutionary pressure than they've had to face in the past. And we need to be very thoughtful about what we express from these source codes and what we don't express. Do that thoughtfully, and also look at where is there a skillful evolution.
The epigenetic element is fascinating. You mentioned something that makes me want to highlight. When I first got to know what Cultural Infusions Atlas was doing, I was asked some questions. What cultures not only did you come from or that your grandparents came from, what cultures do you identify with that are influencing who you are? And I have nothing to do with Japanese culture except that it influences me. And I love everything from ikigai to kaizen and even origami, if you can call it a culture. It's very peace inducing for me. But I never thought until I was presented with that type of a question, how do you identify as a person? Is it tied just to my genetics and my circumstances? Or are there other cultures or things that have shaped who you are? And then paired with another question, which I found fascinating, is what aspect of your personality do you rank as the most identifying, or that you would choose to, how would you prioritize of the different identities that you have? Which one do you rank in most importance? And it's interesting for me to answer that question, but even more interesting to see insights from folks who, different groups with different intersectionalities, place certain attributes like ethnicity or sexual orientation as number one or number two, depending on different aspects. And this is an interesting question to ask myself. I'm like, oh, how would I rank? Are they all just like equal? Asking timely questions, maybe they don't have to be the right questions at the right time, has become a massive self-discovery opportunity for myself and for the folks that I work with.
And so important, I think, that those don't remain static definitions. When you ask, who are we? Who are people? There's, the identity politics, or the identity aspect, is very static, right? I am a blah, 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 blah. And that's one way to understand who we are. Another way to understand who we are is, as a flow, as a process. What are the sources that are inspiring me in the moment? What impact am I having over time? What impact do I want to have?
Whole dimension to identity, right? It changes, it evolves.
And really letting in that reality that the whole of our identity is alive and changing, evolving continuously. And I think there's a lot more for us to contemplate on the topic of the role of humans in future. But for now, Ben, it's been a joy to connect. Any last thoughts for everybody listening to the podcast?
I would flip the intelligence quotient, IQ, to QI, question intelligence. I think that's the opportune of our time when it comes to this post-AI economy, is how well can we design the right questions? The right questions provoke knowledge that wasn't there before.
Nice. Questioning intelligence. I love that. Questioning inside, questioning outside, asking the right questions. That's very beautiful. Ben, thank you so much. It's a joy to have a chance to connect and be influenced by each other.
Thank you, Andrew.